Welcome to the latest episode of the Mind Gut Conversation podcast, a place to learn about new ideas from thought leaders in the area of optimal health and the science of mind gut microbiome interactions. Today, I have the great pleasure and honor to speak to Dr. Tim Spector, an internationally renowned authority in the field of microbiome science and personalized nutrition. Dr. Spector is a professor of genetic epidemiology at King's College London and honorary consultant physician at Geese and St. Thomas National Health System Foundation Trust. He founded TwinsUK in 1992, which is now one of the richest collections of clinical data in the world. He's the lead researcher behind the world's biggest citizen science health project, the Covid Symptom Study app, and is the scientific co-founder of the company Zoe. Throughout his career, Dr. Spector has received many awards and prizes, and he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology and the Academy of Medical Sciences. He has published over 900 scientific papers and is ranked by Google as being in the top 100 most cited scientists in the world. In addition to his scientific publications, he has published 4 popular books, including the best-selling Diet Myth, Spoon-Fed, and more recently, Food for Life, a Sunday Times bestseller. Welcome to the show, Tim. Tim, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. From reading and following you in your publications, it definitely seems we're on a similar wavelength, even though you come from it from a different side. But I want to ask you a few questions related to some of the activities that you're pursuing. So the first question has to do with precision diet. And it's going to preface this with human diets have evolved in response to genetics, climate, traditions, religion, which are all variable around the world, but within certain contexts, fairly dominant. And they're not based on expensive stool and blood tests we're using today to personalize diet. What has changed?
Well, I think you've got to look at the sort of evolution of our diets along with our evolution of mankind and the timescales involved. And I would suggest that actually we've evolved to adapt to our diets more than our diets have evolved to adapt to us. And there are a few good examples. The ability to drink milk required a gene mutation in the lactose digestion gene lactase, which most people on the planet still don't have. 80% don't lack it, but various groups of people, a few in Africa, few in the Middle East, and most Northern Europeans developed it so they could survive by bringing cattle with them as they moved north. And that only probably happened in the last 10,000 years. There's sort of similar examples. I'm saying this because I used to be a geneticist. I used to study this stuff. So starch genes. So people who have starchy diets, who are eating tubers, dug out of the ground, the sort of things like potatoes. In order to get the nutrients from them, certain people develop genes that could really increase the ability to digest them. So I think that, and there's similar stories about alcohol. So we've ended up actually some people having these genes or these traits, and other people not. So we know there's a difference between people in response to these foods, rather than us simply adapting to that food, although both have probably happened around the same time. I think that the key is that not only do foods differ all across the globe and diets, if you think of those in the polar regions and those on the equator, and And the basic human blueprint was an omnivore that could adapt to anything. But after a few generations in a spot, then there would be differences in how people responded, and the people that responded better would survive and others wouldn't. So I think those two processes have been going on hand in hand, and I've got to realize that it's only like 9,000 years since agriculture, which is a tiny 1 second of a whole day in our evolutionary terms. So most of the time we were hunter-gatherers, and I guess we had different responses because we didn't really know what we were going to be eating, and so some people were adapted for eating fats, and other people were more adapted to eating starchy tubers, and that's why we've ended up in this position, because we are pretty good omnivores. We can survive in very different diets and climates, and I think that's my sort of simple explanation. But now we're all being forced to eat the same standard American diet. We are starting to see these differences between people.
So it's really, I like this explanation. So it's really become apparent with this dominance of one type of diet that a lot of people do not respond to well.
Yeah, and the ability that when we started realizing that we had started getting the tools, like originally genetics and now microbiome, and the ability to look at metabolites, that people responded differently to these same foods, because that's quite a new concept as well. The old-fashioned concept of nutrition is that one size fits all. We all react the same way. If we all have exactly the same calories, then we're going to respond the same way. And if everyone has this certain reaction to fats, and there's a certain limit, and of course, we now know that's rubbish.
Do you think this fact of migration of people moving all over the world from different backgrounds, different nutritional habits into, for example, the UK or the US, that is another factor? So you have now a more heterogeneous group of people from all these different backgrounds, genetic and.
Yeah, that's right. So that's why we're seeing people from Asia moving to the US and the UK who have no ability to deal with milk products genetically, and perhaps different abilities to use starch. And we already know about alcohol, and when most Asian groups are drinking alcohol, they have very different response to Europeans. So these are the environments that are very different. And the studies show that when you look at migration, particularly say the gut microbiome, which you and I recognize as a really good marker of overall health, it goes from being very good, and then within 2 or 3 generations, it's blended into the American gut microbiome, which isn't very good. So it does take time, but initially there's some protection from the original diets and the original culture, but unlike the genes, the microbes are changing much faster.
Yeah.
And so we've got these two systems that allow us to evolve, I think. The genes, which are slow, and the microbiome, which is fast. And it's probably it's not by chance that we have these systems. And I think that's probably how we evolved to have this rapid changing system that actually can change in a few days or weeks, plus this other one that takes generations.
Yeah, so my view on this, and also, it's shared by investigators at Stanford, this concept of a mismatch between the microbial rapid adaptation to different foods and the very slow, like 10,000 years genetic adaptation of of the host. And when I talk to host, it's including the immune system. So we have this mismatch leading, I mean, it's one hypothesis leading to this low-grade chronic inflammation that's now sort of seems to be becoming the explanation for the majority of chronic non-infectious diseases. I mean, do you agree with that idea that?
No, I read your recent book, and a lot of these theories are in there, and I think this mismatch really is absolutely right. We've got these two primitive systems, genes and immune system, and you've got the middleman, if you like, the microbiome, that is, on the one hand, can save our life, but the other time, if we eat a burger or something, it's going to suddenly change and give up the wrong signals, as if, that means this is our staple food. We've moved down the jungle, and suddenly, we're digging up burgers now. So, and I think our evolution didn't have our current food system in mind when it planned this really brilliant scheme. for our bodies.
So, sort of a follow-up to my first question. So, what is precision nutrition? What exactly does this mean? So, I mean, a lot of scientists know it, but for the lay public, what is precision nutrition?
Well, there was a lot of discussion a few years ago about what's the difference between personalized nutrition and precision nutrition. I tend to view the differences as rather semantic in terms for the public. I think it depends the context we're talking about, but it means that when someone's giving you advice about what to eat, it shouldn't be general to everybody. Oh, well, all males need to eat this and all females eat that. It should be categorized down to your personal circumstances, your age, your ethnic group, your genes, your gut microbiome, and potentially, what we believe at Zoe, your biological responses to carbs, proteins, and fats, which we know is very different. And if you personalize these responses, then you're more likely to get a good result, in the same way as personalizing medicine. So I like to think of this that, we've been talking about personalized medications and pharmaceuticals for 20 years or so. It's quite an accepted idea that you might have a different dose of a medicine in order to get the right result. And there's great examples with blood clotting agents and things like this, that based on your profiles and genes, you should be given the right dose, otherwise you might bleed or it doesn't work. The same really is true of diet, because if you think of food, as I now do, as thousands of chemicals, basically there should be no difference in mentally about thinking about pharmaceuticals or about groups of foods that actually when you break them down, each food, like a carrot, is 800 chemicals. It's essentially that your body's responding to. It doesn't see the colors or anything else. It just sees the chemicals. That's what your microbes see. So I think it's the idea that if you can tailor design your food for you, you will have a much better experience. Your body's going to be much more efficient, and it's going to be making sure you have, everything is at the optimum. So the rise in sugar is not excessive, but it's sufficient to give you the energy. Your fat levels in your body are not hanging around so long, because in some people that causes inflammation and heart disease and other problems, and that you're giving your gut microbes really the key nutrients they need, and trying to sort of prioritize the groups of microbes they're lacking. So that's the general principle, and we've done some studies at Zoe to show that that approach not only is true, but it also then works in practice. So we've done a couple of studies,
So you're
which you might have heard of.
So you're referring to the PREDICT study?
Yes. So the PREDICT study came out, I think, in Nature Medicine in about 2021. So it was the biggest food intervention study done, I think, of that scale. 1,100 people, mostly twins from the UK, but a few from Mass General in Boston, and they all get identical meals. So they all got essentially these like these muffins that had sort of high fat and high sugar, trying to mirror the American diet in terms of the constituents. And then while they were in hospital, we plotted their blood level responses to these. And we also looked at their gut microbiome. And it turned out that there was a tenfold difference in the blood sugar response, tenfold difference in the blood triglyceride, that's the blood fat response, after taking these foods between people. And there was even differences within identical twins. So that for me was quite an aha moment, because suddenly up to that point we'd said, well, there might be a few genetic differences, but mostly these are going to be quite trivial, so therefore we can advise people the same way, and this really blew that out out of the water, that theory. So we knew there was this big variation between people eating the same food at the same time in laboratory conditions, and it was consistent. So that was cool. So we did this study. We used glucose monitors on everybody. We, home pinpricking, and they were logging their meals. And we did genetic microbiome analysis of all their stool samples. And I think that was a real landmark study that allowed us to have the basis for a commercial product at Zoe, which was the base of our scoring system. So that based on there are several of these cookies with different combinations of fats and sugars. We could then tell everybody how they're likely to respond to any food, given that we knew what that was in that food. So that was the basis of then, rather than saying all foods are good, bad, or not whatever, we scored everything from 0 to 100, and that was the basis of the commercial product Zoe, which is going today. And we recently published again in Nature Medicine a randomized trial of people who've used this system in the US and doing it all at home themselves in the slimmed down commercial product, and compared that to the USDA eating guidelines, which is reduce your fat, reduce your calories, eat more fruit and veg, general advice. And the Zoe program did much better. So it improved on the major endpoints of gut health, energy levels, mood, blood parameters, triglyceride, inflammation, mood and energy. Really, nearly everything we measured improved, compared to the low calorie group that did lose weight but then quickly regained it, which is classical for this. So we think this is a method that is based on science, but it's more of a pragmatic method, because we don't tell people to stop eating anything. We're just trying to make people make sensible swaps in a way that can last for years and decades. And so we're not going for rapid weight loss. We are really trying to switch things so you get less sugar spikes, which we know is related to energy levels and mood, and stops you getting hungrier. And also, the fat ones, which is inflammation, mainly inflammation, that if that triglyceride's hanging around the body, it seems to irritate the immune system and cause inflammation. So we're reducing that. And then we're trying to improve the gut microbiome health, and we've now got over 100,000 samples we've looked at, and we've now got a new scoring system for the gut microbiome based on good and bad bugs that change when you have the system. So it's a very long-winded reply. I'm sorry about that, but it's exciting to be able to do this science, look at it, have a product, test it, do a randomized controlled trial, which nobody in the field of nutrition does. You might have noticed from your Instagram feeds and Twitter. So we're very proud of that, because it's always a gamble when you do it, because as you know, you have to commit when you do a proper trial like that.
Yeah, it's definitely a landmark study. For those listeners who have not heard the word Zoe and the company, do you just want to say a few words exactly what Zoe is and how it unfolded?
Yeah, it is pronounced Zoe as opposed to Zoe, which many Americans get confused with. It's a science and nutrition company that we founded in 2017 that is in operation in the US and the UK. We have offices in Boston and in London. And it's basically a program that helps you make the right food choices in order to be healthy for years. And it does that mainly through this testing program, where you get a slimmed down version of what we did in the PREDICT study, a home kit, microbiome analysis, continuous glucose monitor. But compared to these programs that only do glucose or only do lipids or whatever, it's a much more holistic idea. We know that not one thing counts, it's the whole panel together. You get your scores, and then you get invited to go on a journey with us for several months to basically keep changing your pattern of eating, logging your food, seeing what's going on, avoiding ultra-processed foods, doing things to keep improving your gut microbiome, so that increasing the fiber, increasing your diversity, increasing polyphenols, giving your gut a rest, this intermittent fasting idea, and switching the protein, reducing your meat intake and adding in pulses and lentils. So it's still full of sensible generic advice, but plus this element of personalization. And this is the idea, and people who follow that will go on and feel much better than people who aren't. And that's why we've been successful. We have more we've been pushing the UK more, where I'm very well known because of the work that Zoe did during COVID, where we had about 4.5 million people using an infectious disease app that tracked progress. But we've had pretty good success in the US, but the product continues to improve, and we're about to launch a product in the US actually that's launched last month here, which is a sort of quicker way of getting to this. It's freeze-dried 30 plants that which includes 6 fungi. So we not officially plants, but it's a prebiotic supplement, and we have just also finished a randomized controlled trial of that against placebo and against a probiotic, and showed that in 3 months you can really improve your gut microbiome and your overall health as well. So that is an addition to food. It's not instead of food. And again, we're proud that we're doing science behind this. And Zoe, the company, has co-authored at least 50 papers now in this time, many of them in journals like Nature Medicine, which are the sort of the Oscars of science, really. So it's a high bar. So so that's where we're at. We want people to make the right food choices, and we want to use science to help them make it. And we also have a very informative nutrition podcast as well called Science and Nutrition, which is the #1 English-speaking nutrition podcast at the moment, and that's free. So you don't have to pay to be able to get the sort of the concepts and the ideas of what we're talking about. But it is available now if any of the listeners do want to try it out and particularly interested in any of those features. But the key is not focusing on one, where it's the the blood sugar, the blood fat, the microbiome. It's this overall concept of shifting our idea of what a healthy diet is. And hopefully, once you've done this program, which is a large scale educational, you can make a lot of these changes yourself.
Do you have any evidence how many people that initially get like the Zoe test and the initial recommendations, how many stay with it on a long-term basis?
Well, it depends at what time we were doing this, because we've changed our strategy. We started off with a very short-term test and manage it, because startups evolve. They have to by necessity, because they don't really know what the results are going to be. So all I would say now is that we have most people now sign up for 12 months in the current package. They have an option of 4 months or 12 months, and it's over half are renewing, I think, is the current stat I have. It will vary by country and things, so I don't know the exact figures. So it's better than most products in terms of that, and but like all of them, it suits some people more than others, and I think that's the other message. Even personalized medicine has to be personalized. Some people prefer just to take a daily 30 and not mess around with logging and the complications of it. Others do that. That's why increasingly we're going for a suite of products that will go from the person who just wants a bit of education and pointing in the right direction, those that just want a simple product that's going to help their gut health, for example, and boost their fiber, because one scoop has 5 grams of fiber, which and 1 to 2 scoops a day is a significant boost. And others want the full program, or maybe even more intensive with retesting, etc. And I should mention that everyone gets a digital coach as well. So we have trained nutritionists who are advising people on this journey, and it's an important feature that people really like, who stay with it. That's one of the main reasons they stick with this, and they feel part of a research program as well. That's the other thing. So we use all their data back in our research to improve things like the microbiome scores, and to work out which foods are associated with which microbes and which diseases, so that we can improve the personalized advice, particularly on the microbiome we give to people, which is really pretty poor at the moment, as you probably know from the standard testing, because the numbers have just been too small. It's very much like the early days of genetics, where we thought we discovered all the genes and they were important, until we realized there were 1,000 times more, and it was more complicated.
Yeah, and I mean that's sort of another topic. I don't want to really get into this. I mean, there are these stool test companies out there, and they're promoting themselves as that's the whole answer, and it will keep you from developing Alzheimer's disease. And I mean, that's obviously way too early to make these claims. I personally believe ultimately we will have ways of doing that. I mean, maybe not looking at the bugs themselves, but on the metabolites that they create, or metabolite patterns. But it's right now, so a lot of patients come to my clinic with a printout of 15 pages with all their organisms, and then they ask you, what does that mean for me? Because their primary care physician has no idea what it means. And when you look at it, I mean, you can't really make these predictions right now. And it's an early, as I say, it's an early stage of this science.
Well, I 100% agree. People are being misled, and while we can probably agree that the state of your gut health is a better state of your health than looking at your DNA or your genes, it's not specific. So, there's hardly any disease there that, apart from maybe some infections, gut infections, that you would pinpoint with the gut microbiome. So we don't make any claims to do that. We're using it just as a way through big data sets to link to certain microbe food associations with general health, not with specific health. And we know that we can't find specific microbes for specific diseases, but and that's why we've now come up with a new score. Actually, you might be interested in. It's still under review, but it should be coming out soon. Which was, rather than diversity of the gut microbiome, which is the current sort of gold standard, which has been problematic for things like vegans and vegetarians, and didn't quite work. It doesn't work in trials very well. Sometimes adding in fiber, the diversity got worse. I don't know if you've seen those studies, but they were quite interesting. So we've taken that, and we've now got our 50 top beneficial microbes and the 50 worst microbes that associated with poor health from our big data set, which is over 100,000 people. And we now know that most people have these 100, so we can use that as a really consistent ratio, and it works in vegans, vegetarians, Americans, Brits, ethnic diversity, but importantly, it works in trials. So if you do an intervention trial increasing fiber and health, and like people on the Zoe program, you get a change in the score in like 85 to 90% of people. So compared to diversity, it's a real step forward. So this is the sort of things we're doing with this data, and I think this is a much more sensible, scientific-led way of using it. That's why we don't give people this, 26-page recommendations, which is based on thin air, or tell them to, buy our vitamins, which is that's how they make their money. It's just say, this is your gut health score, do all this stuff and hope that, in a year's time, you can check it and it's improved, which, our trials show that it should do in 85% of cases. So that's sort of where we are. But we realize that it's, we might want to change this in 3 years' time to something even better.
No, I mean, it's really refreshing to hear this kind of information from an expert like you, because I always get totally frustrated and angry, listening all the stuff that's floating right now, and people spend money on, put false hopes on. It's kind of amazing that I don't know how you would control it. You can't really forbid people to publish this kind of stuff, or publish it online, not in papers. But it is a shame that, and I think it's partially a fault of people in academics that we have not taken on more the role of propagating the correct information and the correct studies, like you guys have done. So it's
well, academics generally don't go they're either into the commercial world or they're against it. So they sort of say, well, that's the commercial world, I'm not dealing with that, rather than saying, well, I actually endorse this one because it's scientific, but I don't endorse this one. And you start getting a sort of, the public know what actually, the scientific opinions are, rather than just reading a website where they've got a lot of MDs with white coats on the consulting board, and wearing stethoscopes. So that's but you're right, there's this vacuum, and I think scientists and doctors ought to speak out more about what they think. Companies that don't do any peer-reviewed research, that don't of any quality, that don't do randomized trials, they shouldn't be claiming stuff.
Yeah. So there's a couple of topics I really want to get your opinion on. So one is, and you mentioned this earlier, time-restricted eating, or I like to the term time-restricted eating rather than fasting, because I think fasting for the average person is not really realistic for any length of time. But time-restricted eating is. And I have to say, from personal experience during the pandemic, we started this in our own family, and it's not that hard. I mean, certainly you have to be willing to make certain exceptions when you travel different countries, when you socialize.
Oh yeah.
So it's not a religion, but it's a pattern of that you can build into your daily life fairly easily. So what is your view on that? I mean, there's pretty good data in preclinical studies on that, pretty impressive data. The human studies, as usual, were not as easy to support that. They're both for and against it, or didn't see an effect. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I started this because I was interested, because in the UK we're all told to never skip breakfast. Okay, this is like the only famous thing about British cuisine is the breakfast, right? So if we lose that, that's it. We've got nothing. So that's why parents and schools say you've got to have a full breakfast before you go to work or school or whatever it is. So I was interested in where that information came from, and I started questioning it. And some of my books, a couple of books ago, I researched it, and it turned out that actually there was no evidence that it was bad to skip breakfast, apart from association studies that show that people who regularly skip breakfast, were overweight. But it was probably because they were overweight, they were skipping breakfast, they could lose weight, but actually it made it worse. So when they did randomized trials, which is the gold standard, they found either no difference in weight or mental abilities, or actually a slight improvement over time. So the meta-analyses are actually showing a slight benefit of skipping breakfast. When it comes to time restriction, and that's a sort of surrogate for time restricted eating, because before the term became popular, then you got these time restricted eating studies, and a lot of them were comparing against calorie controlled diets. So which I think we need to say, I'm certainly not in favor of them at all. I don't know about you, but I think they're on the way out. That's the quick fix that bounces back. It's going to be a waste of time. Your body's going to override it very quickly. But when you cut out those ones, you do see some mild microbiome benefits, and certainly all the evidence suggests that the microbiome needs time to heal its gut wall, etc., by not eating. And the night team that come out when you're not eating do seem to be the good guys. So there's lots of theoretical reasons why it should be good. And in the sort of clinical studies where they haven't generally mixed the microbiome with the clinical data, sadly, it's really annoying. There seem to be generally there is some weight loss in the time restricted eating group, although recent studies have suggested that's not because of sort of faster metabolism, but actually they just tend to be eating less. But that doesn't worry. I don't mind either way, actually, because it probably reduces hunger, and because you're getting less spikes, less snacks, you're thinking about it. In general, that's true. And what we can add to this is we did a big study, which we haven't published yet, of 140,000 people, that called the Big If study. These were all people who've been helping Zoe during COVID and said, yes, I'm willing to go on doing this for 3 weeks. It was a 14-hour overnight fast. They could pick whether it was early or late. And of those 140,000 who were unselected, they just said, oh, okay, I'll give it a try. About a third managed to do it all the time for 3 weeks. So it suggests it's not for everybody, right? So some people found it hard and gave up or didn't like the idea and whatever. So we always have a slightly distorted idea when we're talking amongst ourselves who are interested about how easy it is. So, but a third of people found it easy, and they lost weight, their mood improved, their energy improved, they slept better, and they felt less hungry. And, reports of some of them reducing their blood pressure meds and things like this. It all self-report, but I think that's the story I get. It is effective, but it's not for everybody. There are some people that get hungry as soon as they wake up. They do need to snack, or they feel they need to snack, and are very uncomfortable. So again, we can't have one size fits all for everybody, but if you can do it, and particularly, I think, not eating in the middle of the night or late at night or early in the morning if you're not hungry, it is quite important. So even if you can only, stretch it by an hour, from 10 hours to 11 hours, I think it is beneficial. And so that's part of our ongoing advice until we get more data, that it's generally a good thing. But I wouldn't take it to extreme. I don't think these sort of 16, 18-hour ones are sustainable for most people. Although people report being good at, I'm not interested in something that only 1% of the population can do. I think we need to be just sort of shifting everybody in that direction.
It's sort of another example, and I'm sure you're thinking about it, of personalization. So there may be markers that you detect by your wide screening of all kinds of parameters that benefit, or for whom it's the easiest to do that, and then you would recommend to that group to add this to the regimen.
Yeah, no, that is something it was on our list of things to do, which is sort of a bit like and it might be related to the early bird, or night lark idea, that when we did this study, we told people they could either eat early on, so they have like their breakfast at 7 or 8 a.m. and they stop eating at 5 or 6 p.m., or they could, start eating at, say, 11 a.m. and then finish at 9 p.m. And 2/3 of people chose the latter. A third of the ones who were successful chose the beginning one. And although the studies show that if you can do it in the beginning, it's slightly more beneficial, but it sounds like it's harder to do. So therefore, most people who have a social life and go out after 6 p.m. Will go for that one. But I think the other lesson we learned was that if you can do it at least 5 days a week, that's probably fine. Yeah. If you can do it long term. And I think that's my general philosophy through all the stuff I'm talking about is, 80% of the time is fine. Don't beat yourself up if you can't do it all the time, because it's much more important to not give up because you failed and carry on with this broad pattern. It's much more important. Yeah, so everyone should give it a go, and don't worry if you can't do it, and don't worry if you can't do it every day, because suddenly all your friends are phoning you to go out and do stuff. So it's really important to enjoy yourself and to enjoy food.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I mean, the hedonic aspect of food is obviously something that's programmed into our brain, and to neglect this and make food a religion, or forcing yourself to do things that are not natural, and is a big mistake, I think. I mean, we always
that's right. So some of these extreme fasting groups, they can end up being rather antisocial, and realize the health advantages of social eating is really important. So especially in the US, where 1 in 5 meals are eaten inside the automobile. It's not great. So you don't want to make that even worse. So really important that people do have those meals, enjoy that, and have at a time that is really sociable. So that's that should be the core of it, not some rigid plan.
Even in our profession, I've often commented on this. So the typical lunch meetings or lunch lectures, where you eat you wouldn't even know afterwards what you've eaten, because you focus on the presentation. And then typically, even in a place like UCLA, they serve Diet Coke or Coke with it. Nobody pays any attention to it. So sadly, it's a big part of this culture that we have developed in academics.
Yeah, I was in Johns Hopkins for a few months, and I still remember the mountains of donuts that have on the around the seminar table. That and they don't do this in other countries. That's the other thing. It's very much an English speaking thing. So I go to Spain and Italy a lot, and they would never dream of doing that because they would eat nothing. They just might have coffee, might have tea, but they would go and have either have nothing or a proper meal, but they wouldn't have this sort of halfway house where, as you said, you're mindlessly filling your body with sugar and fat and not really appreciating it either.
Yeah. Another question that, so longevity and health span are sort of expressions right now that are very popular. So a lot of people promote things for increase your longevity. Some are ridiculous, some recommendations from some prominent people with hundreds of thousands of followers. Do you think there's a causative relationship between the type of things we've been talking about, gut health and longevity, or do you think there's other factors? And let me give you one example. So I've never really gotten a convincing answer to this question. There's an increased number of centenarians in certain countries in the world. So Japan and I think South Korea and even Italy, where this is a rapidly growing percentage of it's still small overall, but it's rapidly growing. And I don't think that these people have really dramatically changed either their eating habits or their lifestyle. So what role do you think that a healthy diet and other lifestyle modifications play in longevity and particularly the increase in the health span? I mean, we don't want to, spend the last 20 years of our lives in sort of a dilapidated state, being totally dependent on the medical system. But so what is your thought on that?
Well, wearing my epidemiology hat, all the data of the last 50 years suggests that 70 to 80% of the differences in people's mortality and lifespan as an adult, at least, can be improved by diet. So, if you switch people with the worst diet to the people with the best diet, you would reduce all chronic diseases by about 70 to 75%. So it's by far the biggest factor. And some of that is going to be in health span, because you won't be getting that diabetes, you won't be getting some of those early cancers, diet-related cancers, etc. And some of it will be on overall longevity. But I mean, certainly we haven't shifted. We've become longer living, but we haven't improved our health span in the last 50 years. I think the data I've been seeing is that these centenarians have peaked, and the last sort of 10 years, we're not seeing those same ones. So I was speaking to some epidemiologists who've been to places like Okinawa and others in Singapore and things, and we seem to see peaks of 10 to 20 years ago, and all these really old people were being recorded, and their children are not overtaking them. They're actually going down. And I think the US and the UK are the two countries where actually some of these survival rates, it's looking like we're going to live less long than our parents. So these curves, I mean, they're hard to interpret, but I think we mustn't overinterpret these little pockets of villages, which are genetically quite distinct. They're quite isolated, and there are also factors such as they're all on hills. So these, if you saw the Blue Zones program, that summed it up very well. Nearly all of them, they're doing a lot of physical exercise all the time, and their diet hasn't really changed much in 50 years. So I think there was an element that group of people benefited from the early life where they had relatively non-processed healthy food in a reasonable diversity, in a healthy environment, lots of physical activity. And then when they got to middle age, medical science was there to make sure they kept going. So, and that's why they might end up being the peak generation, if you like, of this century, who knows? Whereas we might have all the medical attention at this end of life, but we were given the wrong foods, the wrong advice, pollution, stresses, who knows what else, and so we didn't get that sort of addition, that early boost. That's just a total theory. There are connections between aging and the microbiome. They're not well worked out. So there are weak correlations between it. I'd say aging is not as clear-cut drop in your microbiome as you might expect with other blood markers and things, but it does go down slightly, and then there's a drop off after about 75 in most populations we've seen. But so we don't really understand whether that's cause or effect at the moment. There haven't been enough of those studies, but you and I both believe in inflammation as a really big driver of most chronic diseases, and I think there's a lot of evidence that the microbiome is crucial for controlling inflammation, preventing the immune system overreacting, and therefore disrupting the aging process. So I think time will show that the gut microbiome is really crucial for reducing the speed at which we age. And that's why, one of the key organs really we have to dampen down inflammation. Do you agree with me?
No, I fully agree with you. I couldn't. You said it better than I would say it. I think right now, the way I look at this, I've been involved in the microbiome science for the last 10 years. Before, it was all just, studying brain-gut interactions. The microbiome didn't really exist as an entity that we thought plays any role. Then the first studies came out about the effects on brain function and behavior. And quite honestly, I didn't believe these early studies. I thought we know enough just from the brain and the gut. But what I've seen so far, and being involved in some, like this big Alzheimer consortium where we do some of the analysis, these multi-omic integrations of data. So this is the Alzheimer consortium, the European Alzheimer consortium. And we have these bi-weekly or bi-monthly meetings of all these 30 participating sites. And it's an eye-opener how fast things are moving in terms of technologies and concepts. And so this for me is sort of a reminder, whatever we know right now about the microbiome is just the beginning. It's not, I think we know some key concepts, but we definitely are not to a point where we can, understand, predict, and even more influence the microbiome in a way that would be, the only way we need to influence it is by diet. It's quite possible. But as you know, there's other approaches now that are being done with these GLP-1 agonists that seem to be having an effect on not just on weight, but on diabetes and on
cancer and addiction and
many of these comorbid disorders. And it's quite honestly, it's not surprising to me, because I think that Ozempic effect is somehow related to this inflammation. It decreases that amount of inflammation. But that's not where we want to go. We don't want to have everybody not just on statins, which already has happened. I guess in the UK, like 70% of people over 60 are already on statins. And we don't want the same thing to happen with Ozempic, So what I like about the Ozempic data is it just emphasizes how important that aspect of our health is, and what the prophylactic interventions could be doing.
Well, it's a miracle drug for millions of people, but it's I was working for 20 years in obesity genetics, trying to find that killer product, and we didn't find it, but it came out of, as usual, somewhere else where we weren't looking. It's the old story. If you look too hard in one place, you're not going to find it. You've got to look much more broadly, multidisciplinary, and see what's there. But it does, tell you the power of the signals from the gut and those hormones. And there must be many other things in there that can have other dramatic effects on our body and our brain. I mean, I think that's the other element. I mean, there are signs that some foods, some probiotics, some prebiotics could have similar GLP-1 like effects, and that there are other ways to block these appetite signals. And clearly that's how the microbiome works, but it's as you said, it's going to take us a while to sort it all out. But that's what I find both fascinating and puzzling, is we've got all these different signals, like the sugar spikes we see after meals, that we've shown that some people, 1 in 4 people get in our studies as Zoe get a sugar dip. 1 in 4 who had a pint get a dip, and those people have a 25% increase in eating. They're hungrier 3 hours later. So you've got that process, which may well be mediated by microbes in the small intestine that we can't see or get at. That are doing things, and you might be able to block those with some microbial medicines or probiotics or whatever. We don't know, but it's there can be all these other mechanisms that are playing in, as well as the GLP-1 and the other things.
It sort of reminds me
time.
The early stages of my career. I actually sought out this professor, late John Walsh at UCLA. I don't know if you ever crossed paths with him.
No.
So he sort of got my interest in this area of these, what was used to be called gut peptides. And at that time in his lab, there were radioimmunoassays, and an investigator from Sweden extracted from tons of pig intestines these peptides, and then we measured them in Walsh's lab. And a couple years later, people found the same peptides in the brain, and so they became regulatory peptides. And in the meantime, we have about 40 of these stored in the gut. So GLP-1 is one of them. So you could imagine. And at the time, the big question was, so now that we know that all these peptides are there, what do they do? Is there any clinical implication? And at the time, nobody knew. It was with CCK, for example, cholecystokinin, we knew that it plays a role in gallbladder function and pancreatic function, and but GIP, for example, gastrointestinal inhibitory peptide, at the time the name has changed, is now also one of those. There's medications like GLP-1 that seem to have a similar effect on multiple functions in the body. So I find it amazing that like 40 years later, something that we stumbled on early on. That this.
I want to ask you something, actually, because one of the first things we noticed when we started putting people on the Zoe product, which was designed to reduce sugar spikes and fat peaks and help the gut microbiome, was their mood and energy improve within a week, and by big effects, much bigger than, say, weight or their blood profile changes or anything else. And as doctors, we're not used to asking about mood and energy. So there's very little data out there, but it was striking how that happened. And I wonder, where would you speculate that's happening from? Because it's probably not a direct effect of the sugar. Do you think that could be mediated from some gut hormones that have changed
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
they're
Absolutely.
doing it? What would you?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of discussions at the time. So first, so we found these peptides in the gut in these specialized cells. Then the initial concept was they get released into the bloodstream and reach the brain. But then that was rapidly replaced by the idea that they stimulate these sensory vagal afferent nerves, and that is a fast signal to the brain, faster than the endocrine dimension. And I think now we understand it's really a combination. There's a lot of integration that happens in the periphery, in the gut. So these vagal nerves get not just the information from one hormone, but from the interaction of several. And then there's multiple steps of integration, the brainstem and the vagal, the nucleus tractus solitarius. So I think this is a system, and maybe this whole GLP-1 story will renew the interest in looking at the other players in this system.
But plus all the metabolites produced by microbes, because
Exactly.
there are thousands of those which we don't currently know about or measure, do we? So
Yes. Yeah, so I mean the vagus nerve, there was another topic that was very hot at the time because surgeons did total vagotomies for peptic ulcer disease. So this was the main therapy. And then
I'm old enough to remember when, I was an intern. We used to, assist on those operations.
Yeah, and then the most interesting thing with that was it worked for the ulcer, but a certain percentage, I forgot what the percentage was, developed what was called at the time the albatross syndrome, which was mental. They could no longer function properly. So nothing else was done, nothing was done to their brain, but it was just they were disconnected from their vagal signals from the gut.
Oh, I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
Yeah, so nobody ever really pursued that in great deal, and we'll never be able to do it because we don't do these surgeries anymore. I would love to know, to have this population today and apply our own concepts to it. But to answer your question, I think there's a lot of possibilities. How now the signals are much more complex than we thought at the time. It's not one peptide that does one thing. It's this system that has multiple players, microbe generated, gut generated, that all interact at different sites of the brain gut system to influence the brain, emotional parts of the brain, cognitive parts. And, as you know, we always in our studies, in these multi-omics studies, we look at the brain as well, which keeps us from doing larger studies because, just the cost of it. We have just submitted a grant where we use the UK Biobank data to test these hypotheses on a much larger sample. But I think this is one part of medicine and understanding physiology, which in my opinion was triggered this renaissance by the GLP-1 story and the GIP story, that I'm sure pharmaceutical companies will pursue this further. They will not just stop here because it's probably one of the most lucrative drugs ever developed. So
do you think there could, because I mean, the alternative explanation is that the reason that these Zoe members improve their mood and energy so quickly is that inflammation in the brain is dropping, right? So it could be a general effect, or it could be a GLP-1 like effect where there's a mood and energy receptor that is being triggered or blocked in some way we don't understand. And my only fear is if we go down that we must find the next receptor. It's a bit like the serotonin story that after Prozac, nothing happened for 30 years because we tried to do the same thing. which way, should we go, do you think?
I think the low-grade inflammation in the brain is, there's more glial cells in the brain than neurons, and we know from animal studies how they can get activated by low-dose cytokines or lipopolysaccharide from microbes, actually. These receptors that would activate these glial cells, which then start producing cytokines. That's also a very plausible mechanism, that would affect mood. And how fast that can change, I don't know. I don't think people have looked at time courses. So if you have this immune system activated in your brain, if you change something in your diet, how fast is this turned down? There was one thing, just thinking about it.
Just need some PET scanners, don't you? Just need 1,000 PET scanners, and you can.
Yeah. I mean, there was something, in research in rheumatoid arthritis and in IBD that with some of these biologics, they take quite a time to decrease the inflammation, but there was like almost an immediate effect on the same symptoms that you say, on mood and energy.
Yeah.
And there was one study in rheumatoid arthritis patients that actually showed it had an effect on the brain, like a very early effect. So this is something, yeah, definitely a very plausible explanation for that as well.
Yeah, well, it's an exciting time to be looking at the brain again, isn't it? And the gut, as I said. So it's there are whole bits of the gut we still can't access or see. So it's that's why the small intestine is a bit like other bits of the brain that are hard to access. But you can't even image them. At least you can image them in the brain now.
Yeah. So Tim, I mean, this was really a fascinating conversation, I have to say. I mean, I wish we had this 20 years ago. It's kind of really amazing.
Would have been shorter 20 years ago, but
yeah, it would have been shorter. Yeah. But I hope we can do it in the future. I'd love to stay in contact and pursue this further. Yeah. Also, I still wanted to congratulate you again for what these amazing studies that you guys have pulled off, and for the creation of Zoe, which is really stands alone in a. It's becoming a competitive field, but I think what you're doing with this approach is pretty unique, and I think much more promising than many of the other efforts that are being marketed.
So, yeah, well, that's very kind, and hope you get to try Zoe. Have you been offered?
Yeah, I just recently got the big package. I've not started it because we're actually leaving town on Wednesday, so I didn't start it before that.
Hopefully your gut health is above average, so that otherwise be very embarrassing, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But too much Leberkäse and Spätzle.
Yeah, not anymore. I mean, it's when I look back, it's also an interesting phenomenon. I often think back at the time when I grew up in a Bavarian small town in Bavaria. The food on a macroscopic level was quite unhealthy given today's criteria and insights. But on the other hand, everything was natural. There was these pesticides didn't exist, and it was the way the food was grown was different. And we did a lot of exercise. No matter what the weather was, we went skiing or hiking in the mountains. It was a town in the mountains. And so the lifestyle was extremely healthy, and so I think part of this compensated for the unhealthy diet. And then at some point, obviously influenced by my research and also by my wife, who's a pescatarian, we really changed our diet and are pretty strict about it. And I could not see myself going back, even when we go back to Germany. I think the only thing I couldn't stop eating are the soft pretzels, which I'm addicted to.
You could have some comfort food, haven't you? That's right. Yeah, that's great. Okay, but you're giving the bratwurst a miss now.
Yeah. Yeah, so sausage is obviously some of the worst food, and
The Bavarians did give us sauerkraut, so there you go. There's some good ones, aren't
that
there?
was a good one. There was some other fermented foods. There was brewer's yeast. So when we had a stomach pain, my mother would tell me, yeah, would bring sauerkraut home and then go to the brewery. We had 7 in that small town of 15,000 people. And in the brewery, the back entrance, you get this block of brewer's yeast. And those two things, we ate, and what I remember looking back, obviously maybe tainted memory, but it always helped. I always felt better from these typical early life stomach aches. So it's
There you go. You can market it as a miracle potion now. You see,
yeah.
That's great. Anyway, look forward to another chat very soon. Perhaps I'll look you up when I'm in LA.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
But I hope you enjoyed the Zoe experience, and of course, people can get Zoe throughout the US and hopefully in New York soon, but not yet. Right. Okay.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Lovely to talk to you. Speak soon. Bye.